And onward to 15.2. We've already considered the brainstem, the diencephalon, and the cerebellum, and now we move to the cerebrum, this large region of the brain. When we think about what gives humans the ability to read, write, speak, compose, calculate, learn anatomy, any of these tasks, we tend to associate that with the cerebrum. This part of the brain is much larger in humans than it is in other animals. So our specialized abilities are due to the specialized neural connections that occur in the large cerebrum. So in this view, you're seeing a couple of different orientations of the cerebrum. I do want to point out that we do have these functional lobes. You see frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal, and those lobes correspond to specific regions of the brain. They also correspond to the bones that cover them. The occipital lobe is under the occipital bone, for example. The the wrinkled nature of the brain we can associate to a very large brain growing in a very small space, but we also associate it with specific terms that help us describe regions of the brain. Um, the gyrus, a gyrus is one of these raised sections, one of these hills, if you will. A sulcus is going to be a valley, a shallow valley that actually is between two gyri, and a fissure is going to be a deep valley, like a deep cut. So here's the transverse fissure. This is the longitudinal fissure that actually separates the left and right hemispheres from each other. Deep down in here, they're actually connected, and we'll look at that connections in the connection in a moment. But they're actually you can see this view on the models in lab. You can see it actually in the brain specimens in lab, how there's a long, deep fissure that actually separates the left and right hemisphere. So why do we care so much about these bumps and grooves and gyruses and sulcus, and even naming some? For example, we can name the central sulcus here that separates the frontal and the parietal lobes, or the lateral sulcus that separates the frontal, the parietal, and the temporal lobes. Well, we can actually associate specific brain functions with specific parts of the brain. We'll look in a second at what happens in the precentral and the postcentral gyrus. Pre being in front of the central sulcus, post being behind the central sulcus, but you can see how we can associate specific tasks with specific parts of the brain. While it may look like one big gray mushy thing up there, they're actually very specialized regions within the brain, and we'll talk about how we know what those regions do in just a moment. Let me get out of the way here so we can see this. This brain shows you a little bit more of the functional map. You're not seeing inside the brain. You're not seeing the gray matter and the white matter. You'll see that on a different slide in a moment. And some of the pathology of the brain, some of the issues that we associate with things like schizophrenia are going to be due to how the brain is wired internally. But what you're seeing in this view is how the brain is mapped. That is, what occurs in certain regions of the brain. And let me just kind of start with what we did before. This primary motor area, which you see is number 4 here, is actually the precentral gyrus. This is going to be where many of our motor impulses start, as they're going to be then sent from here along through the cerebellum and then down the spinal cord. So when you move your hand, that thought process actually occurs or originates here. The primary somatosensory cortex is the postcentral gyrus for a large part, and this is going to be where a lot of our sensory somatic sensation is sent. So when it comes up from the brainstem and it goes through the thalamus, it will end up here for processing. That said, there are some other regions that are quite specific in what they do. The primary visual cortex we associate with the occipital lobe, and you see here this primary visual cortex and visual association area. This region of the brain here is where a lot of the visual information is sent. The auditory association regions are primarily going to be in the temporal regions, and we associate those here. The Broca's area and Wernicke's area, these are two I want to highlight because we associate these primarily with speech, with motor actions that we associate with speech. And for about 2/3 of the population, Wernicke's area, the area, here's my mouse here. Wernicke's area is going to be larger on the left side than the right side. And that becomes an issue if someone has a stroke or trauma. If they have most of their speech originating on the left side and they suffer a left side brain injury, then we might expect them to experience some degree of aphasia where they really can't speak as well anymore. Same with stroke. So again, this gives you just a little bit of a map. I'm not going to ask you to label a brain map and show where everything occurs, but it does give you a little bit of a sense of how the brain is specialized. One I didn't mark here, but I do want to emphasize is the frontal lobe has a lot of areas that we associate with memory and with task management and personality. So someone who has a brain injury in these regions can suffer deficits in those particular functions. So something I mentioned a second ago with this idea of hemispheric lateralization is that there can be differences between the left and the right side. And you've probably heard this before, that I am left-brained or I am right-brained. And what the idea is that your reading and writing and listening, for example, was information processed by your left hemisphere, and your imagination and pattern recognition and creativity and intuition was a right brain function. And that actually has been called into question recently. There was a study done that actually, here we go. Where's my mouse? Hang on. There's a study done in 2013 that actually found that this is not necessarily true. They found in the study that of 1,000 people, there really wasn't a big difference in how people use their left or right brain more often. You would think if you're solving a math problem, you're only using the left side of your brain. And while there can be some specialization, like you see down there for language, there doesn't appear to be as much lateralization as we once thought. In other words, if you think you're very creative, it's not just your right side of your brain that's doing that, it's actually both sides. That said, you can see some specialization like you see here. This does show you Wernicke's area being lit up during a functional MRI. This person's been asked to speak, and notice how the neural activity is greater on the left side. You can't see the right side as well, but the left side is showing you a lot of activity. So you do have some lateralization in some functions, but please don't think that if you can do math problems, you're left brain, and if you can't, you're right brain. That is not true. So while we do have the longitudinal fissure that separates the left and the right side, we do have a connection between them. And we have this region here, it's a little hard to see, but this region here, kind of this white T shape, kind of follow the mouse, represents the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is a series of white fiber networks that join the left and the right side. So information does travel back and forth between the hemispheres. When you're solving a math problem, you may be starting the problem on the left side of the brain and information is traveling to the right side, and now you might be getting an intuition impact, or you might be getting another kind of thought process started. So information does travel between the left and the right hemispheres via the corpus callosum. Something that I need to stress to people that they study science and they think that we've got a lot of things figured out. There are still some very basic questions about the brain we don't understand. But a really cool development in 2014 was that researchers did create a brain-wide map of gene expression during prenatal development. What does that mean? They looked at which genes became active as the brain was formed. We really don't know why our brain forms the way it does and why it's so much different than other animals. So by looking at the genes, looking at the information that controls the development of the brain, we're hoping we can learn more about how the brain actually operates in the future, which could help us with things like autism or with schizophrenia or with other disorders. One system I want to mention in particular that you really can't see on the brain map because it's rather deep on the inside of the brain is the limbic system. The limbic system is a rather odd system. Let me come over here. I might write something out for you. The limbic system is a little odd because it actually is going to be incorporated. It's going to be sort of surrounding the upper part of the brainstem and around the corpus callosum, and it functions in emotional behavior and memory. A person with a damaged limbic system fails to recognize fearful expressions in others, or to understand fear when appropriate. It's a very basic, raw emotional system that was supposedly going to be one of the first parts of the brain to form to make you fearful of things that you should be afraid of. But many people have very emotional reactions to things. They probably are relying heavily on their limbic system to process emotions, and maybe not other parts of the brain. The limbic system does include the hippocampus, and I'll just point it out for you here. The hippocampus is a very important region that we associate with the storage of memory. And so, since the hippocampus is so close to the limbic system, or part of the limbic system, that might explain why you probably remember very emotional events far more than you remember intellectual ones. You probably don't remember, how you learned 2 plus 2 because that was an intellectual event, but you may remember your first kiss. And if you've not had one yet, just hang in there. But if you think about things that you do tend to remember more, you tend to remember things that you associate with emotions, and it's probably because a lot of the nerve stimulation of that limbic system is also going to stimulate the hippocampus, and therefore you're going to associate memories far more with emotion than with intellectual pursuits. Finally, in this video, I want to mention the electrical activity that we associate with the brain. At any instant, you have brain neurons are firing millions of impulses, millions of action potentials, and these graded potentials, excitatory or inhibitory signals, and all of that cumulative brain activity is what we call brain waves. These taken together can be measured in these 4 basic patterns: alpha, beta, theta, and delta. We can place electrodes on someone's head like this, and we can actually measure the specific brain waves from different frequencies, which actually gives us an idea of brain activity. An EEG, an electroencephalogram, actually is used to record brain activity. Why do we want to do this? This helps us understand what a normal brain looks like in terms of its electrical activity, and it also helps us understand abnormal brains. If somebody has a brain injury or they have a particular brain issue like brain cancer, we may see a disruption in these electrical activities. Even though we have these 4 patterns, alpha, beta, theta, and delta, we do have some rather unique differences in our brain waves, and those can be used to study our brains as they change over time. So we have brain waves when we sleep. I'm surprised that many people think we don't. Your brains are active when you are asleep. If you have no EEG, if you have a flat line for all of these, then you're clinically brain dead, if there's no electrical activity that we can associate with the brain. Finally, I just want to show you this video. I'm going to switch to it so you can see it. It's a rather cool video. It was just made that actually shows you the electrical activity inside of a brain when a person has just been asked to open and close their eyes and hands. You'll see all the firing, all the electrical activity, which is showing you a combination of all of these different electrical signals that are occurring at one time. Let me switch to that video for you. And this is called the glass brain, which is basically, it's a way of, if you can see inside the brain, it would look like this when the brain is active. And here we go. Hang on. We're thinking about it. It's a cool view. It's worth it. Okay, I think it's going to work. Here we go. Again, what you're seeing here, all of the firing is just showing you different neural activity. The person's simply being asked to open and close. I'm going to pause it. The person is simply being asked to open and close their eyes or their hands, and you just see how much activity is occurring in different parts of the brain. And you might even be able to recognize parts we mentioned, like the primary somatic regions or the primary motor regions that are firing. And if you look at the bottom of the brain, you'll see some of that activity traveling down the spinal cord as well. This is an amazing rendering based on real data. It's not just pretty pictures. They actually have been able to isolate some of these networks to show you these firing patterns. Okay, that's it for this video.